Aegon the Conqueror brought fire and blood to Westeros, but afterwards he gave them peace, prosperity, and justice. Daenerys Targaryen to her supporters. The Storm of Swords, Chapter 71. Daenerys 6. Early into the reign of Aegon the Conqueror, the 7 kingdoms he ruled were still just that. 7 individual kingdoms, many of whom had been rivals for millennia. They were not yet one united realm. Thus, Aegon's biggest concern became peace. Before the conquest, war was just a common part of life in Westeros. Hardly a single year would pass without some form of war breaking out somewhere across the realm. Even in kingdoms that were supposed to be at peace, many of the lords settled their disputes at sword point, in the form of single combat or petty border skirmishes. Aegon's conquering of Westeros and ascension as High King was to, in effect, put an end to all of that, with the concept of the King's Peace. Every lord, no matter how great or petty, every knight, every man, were now expected to take their quarrels and disputes to their liege lord and abide by their ruling and judgments. In cases of arguments between the great houses, any issue would be listened to and judged by the crown itself. In some cases, this would mean the hand of the king or one of Aegon's queens, but more often than not, this meant King Aegon personally. The first law of the land shall be the king's peace, Aegon decreed, and any lord who goes to war without my leave shall be considered a rebel and an enemy of the Iron Throne. The heart of any successful kingdom, its very lifeblood, is trade. A well-managed and booming economy will benefit the richest lord and poorest of small folk. The forming of the 7 kingdoms gave Aegon a chance to reform the disjointed system of taxation across the realm. Before, each kingdom managed their own individual tax affairs, with the rich generally getting richer and the poor with very little hope of any upward mobility. Thus, King Aegon issued decrees regularizing custom duties and taxes throughout the realm. No longer would every port and every petty lord be free to exact however much they could from the tenants, small folk and merchants. He also proclaimed that the holy men and the women of the faith and all their lands and possessions were to be exempt from taxation, and affirmed the right of the faith's own courts to try and sentence any septons, sworn brothers or holy sisters, accused of any crime. Though not himself a godly man, Aegon always took care to court the support of the faith and the High Septon in Old Town, knowing how vital a strong religion is to keeping his new kingdom together. The faith and the High Septon held much power and sway over the small folk and the more pious lords, while Aegon with his dragons was now the undisputed power in Westeros. If House Targaryen's relationship with the faith was not managed carefully, it could result in tensions within the kingdoms, tensions that do not encourage unity. The Cobblecat's cranky old maester used to claim that he could tell one port from another just by the way they smelled. Cities were like women, he insisted. Each one had its own unique scent. Old Town was as flowery as a perfumed dowager. Lannisport was a milkmaid, fresh and earthy, with some wood smoke in her hair. King's Landing reeked like some unwashed whore, but White Harbor's scent was sharp and salty, a little fishy too. The Thoughts of Davos Seaworth, A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 15. Davos 2. Another key pillar at the very heart of Aegon's new Westeros was his new capital city, a city he wanted to make fit for the kings of House Targaryen for generations to come. At the end of the conquest, a large ramshackled village had grown around the Aegonfort, atop Aegon's high hill. This village quickly grew into the proto-King's Landing that spread around all 3 great hills and the Blackwater Rush. These 3 once nameless hills had been named by the small folk for the 3 conquerors, the tallest, Aegon's High Hill, and the 2 lesser hills, Visenya's Hill and the Hill of Rhaenys. The crude Moat and Bailey fort that Aegon had thrown up so quickly was neither large enough nor grand enough to house the king and his court, and had begun to expand even before the conquest was completed. A new keep was erected, all of logs and 50 feet high, with a cavernous long hall beneath it, and a kitchen made of stone and roofed with slate in case of fire. Stables appeared, then a granary. A new watchtower was raised twice as tall as the older one. Soon the Aegonfort was threatening to burst out of its very walls, so a new palisade was raised, enclosing more of the hilltop, creating space enough for a barracks, an armory, a sept, a drum tower, while still a modest keep by the scale of the great seats of Westeros, such as Castle Rock or Winterfell. The Aegonfort only grew in only a short few years, rather than hundreds. The growing town below saw a huge number of wharves, docks and storehouses rising along the muddy banks of the Blackwater Rush, with trade from merchants from across the whole of Westeros, and even as far as the Iron Islands. Even ships from the Free Cities, across the Narrow Sea, were sharing docks with the trading vessels of House Velaryon and Celtigar, with both houses benefiting greatly with the influx of extra trade heading in to the Blackwater Rush. The rush itself was so full of ships, accidents had become a common sight. Long gone were the days a handful of small fishing boats plied their trade in the fast-moving waters. Much of this extra trade would have once gone to towns such as Maidenpool or Duskendale, only a few days' sail to the north of King's Landing. Some maesters, and even the rulers of Duskendale, House Darkland, would argue that the loss of trade to a new town so close to Duskendale ruined Duskendale's economy, and as a result, growth slowed, and the once fast-growing town stagnated. Ironically, this very point would one day be a factor into the downfall of House Targaryen under the Mad King Aerys II, when he was mentally broken after being kidnapped during the defiance of Duskendale. King's Landing, however, saw its first fish market spring up along the banks of the Blackwater Rush, a large cloth market between the three hills. With all this new trade, a custom house was built too, to ensure all duties and taxes were collected correctly. A modest sept opened on the Blackwater, in the hull of an old cog that had been there for decades, no one quite sure how long, or even how it ended up on the bank. The first sept was followed by a stouter one of wattle and daub on the shore further upriver. Then a second sept, twice as large and thrice as grand, was built atop Visenya's hill, with coins sent by the High Septon of the Faith himself. Shops and homes sprouted up like mushrooms after rain. Wealthy men raised walled manses on hillsides, whilst the poor gathered in the squalid hovels of mud and straw in the lower places between. The issue King Aegon faced is while his conquest was years in the planning, no one had thought to have planned King's Landing. Some have suggested it was never Aegon's intent to actually found a city on the site of King's Landing, that it simply just grew. But given what we know about Aegon the Conqueror, it does seem wrong to believe it was entirely unintentional. Most learned men agree that King's Landing was part of Aegon's wider plans, but he did not predict that it would grow so staggeringly fast. At Aegon's first coronation in the Aegonfort, during the initial few weeks of the conquest, it was still a village squatting beneath Moat and Bailey Castle. Even that village had sprung up remarkably fast. By his second coronation in the starry Sept of Gulltown, it had already become a thriving town of several thousand men, women and children, calling it home. By 10 AC it was now a true city, almost as large as Gulltown and White Harbor, and by 25 AC it had outgrown both, to become the third most populous city in Westeros, surpassed now only by Lannisport and Old Town. The rate of growth of King's Landing in 10 years and 25 years seems physically pushing the limits of what is possible. Unlike its rivals, the other four cities in Westeros, Gulltown, Lannisport, White Harbor and Old Town, King's Landing had no walls. It needed none, some of the residents were known to have said. No enemy would ever dare attack the city, so long as it was defended by the Targaryens and their dragons. It is possible the king himself might have shared these views originally, but the death of his sister and wife Rhaenys, and her dragon Meraxes in 10 AC, and the following attacks upon his own person undoubtedly gave him cause to reconsider this idea, more so as he and Visenya spent much of their time away from King's Landing, and not just on Dragonstone, but touring around Westeros on royal progresses. If there were no dragons to defend the city, the King's Landing would effectively be defenceless without a wall. Finally, what convinced Aegon was in the summer of 19 AC, word reached Westeros of a daring raid in the Summer Isles, where a pirate fleet had sacked Tall Tree's town and carried off 1,000 women and children as slaves, along with a fortune in plunder. The account of the raids greatly troubled Aegon, who realised that King's Landing would be similarly vulnerable to an enemy shrewd enough to fall upon the city when he and his sister were elsewhere. Accordingly, Aegon ordered the construction of a ringed wall around King's Landing, as high and strong as those that protect Old Town and Lannisport. The task of building them was conferred upon Grand Maester Garwin and Sir Osmond Strong, the then Hand of the King. To honour the 7 gods, Aegon decreed that the city would have 7 gates, each defended by a massive gatehouse and defensive tower. Work on the walls began the next year and would continue until 26 AC. Now King's Landing was a true city, with walls to rival the likes of the much older ancient cities of Westeros. King's Landing was fastly becoming not just the centre of Westeros, as Aegon had intended, but a home worthy of the last spark of old Valyria, House Targaryen.